Thanks a lot, Harry. Yeah, so Shabby, can you take over?
Well, I started writing. I was actually the director of a big gallery, and I'm quite interested in this idea of conflict of interest. I mean, when I was with the gallery, I remember we represented the artist Subodh Gupta, and I was approached by a magazine to write a feature article on him, and I found it incredibly difficult because you had these two sides. The objective art critic or the writer. It was not a critical piece, it was an art piece. But even then, without that element of critique, I found it incredibly difficult to write that piece because as a gallery director representing an artist, you have a very, it's a very obvious agenda. I was able to balance those different things and eventually push that, piece out, but I found it incredibly challenging and difficult. But those questions do need to be asked, and after that I just said I'm not writing anymore, and then I became independent, and for the last year I have been writing quite a bit for business, lifestyle, and art. But this conflict of interest issue is always there, and I think that the way that I've been able to deal with it is choose topics that don't give you so much pain. So, I mean, there's a different pain in writing, and it has to be the investigative mode. Because the conflict of interest issue is, always alive and well, especially when one is occupying hybrid roles as I do. I'm an artist, I write, I curate, I'm an independent art consultant. So, marrying all those things is quite a challenge. I mean, I just wrote a piece for Abhay on Marina Abramovich, and I loved writing that piece because I don't know her personally, and also it was over there, and it was something that was completely outside of myself, I think one has to give oneself that freedom because objectivity is, I don't know if it exists. I think Girish can probably say more about that as well. But what is objectivity? Because at least I find in every piece that I write that, I am always thinking about that, and I think the art critic's role is obviously always to forefront that, look at the question of objectivity and always keep it in one's mind. I don't think in the real world it really exists in its pure state. But one always attempts to do that, and I think that if the art critic has that principle alive and well, then maybe they're doing their job. The other thing is going back to what Abhay was saying as well, is that I'm very concerned, not concerned, I'm always very aware of my personality, and I think that when the personality of the writer takes over the writing, it's no longer, you're taking it away from the art object in a sense. And one really has to drop a lot of one's fancies and whims when writing because, again, objectivity, if that's the goal, one has to look at the art object and not oneself. And I think the problem I find with a lot of writing is that it's the personality of the writer or the art critic that gets forefronted much more than the art object. And it's a balance that has to be maintained because you do want that voice to emerge from the writing. You want opinions and you want a style, but that's very different from personality, I would say. The other thing is that I write for lifestyle, business, and art. I write on and off for the Economic Times. I write for lifestyle such as Vogue, and also I write for art magazines as well. And one also has to always keep the audience in mind. I know this is going to be this is somewhat controversial because is it about the writer when you're writing about art, or is it about your audience and what you're communicating to them? And so very consciously, I actually write differently for when I'm writing about the art market for the Economic Times, or I'm writing for Vogue. or writing about art, writing for an art magazine where one is required to be more academic, I do always keep my audience in mind and think about that person in front of me. The person who would be reading that, and what am I communicating to that person. So in that sense as well, you're not only investigating a subject or satisfying your own curiosity in a sense, but you're also thinking about the person who's eventually going to be reading that piece. So those are just, I guess, some of the things I want to say about my approach to writing.
Great. Thanks, Sharmishta. And our final speaker this afternoon, before we go into a question session and a discussion, is Adip Datta. Request him to say his piece.
I'd like to start with a response to what Sharmishta said just now. She in fact asked a question as to how objective an art critic is while writing. And in fact, Abhay also asked the same question, that what happens when one writes on an image? What really comes out? In my case, as she's already said to you all before, that I am taking an in-between position. I am a practitioner first, and then I write. And well, the profile says that he also writes, so I'm happy about that. So my position is like that of an insider and an outsider. Through my writing, I look at my practice, I look at others' practice. But if you say so, there isn't an element of objectivity, so to speak, because I relate to those practices that I've drawn from, or the practices that I would relate to. So it is an act of claiming and reclaiming my own artistic voice, and also artistic practices that it falls in my taste and I somehow understand. I admit the fact that an approach as this leads to a situation which you would say that very narrow and not objective, but it is in its own way very focused. It is not. I don't know whether it would be right to say pretentious, or it is clearly taking a position, a definite position. And in answering what Abhay just said, that when I've tried to be objective, and when I've looked at work, when I've seen something in a work, it becomes difficult for me to write. But when I haven't really seen anything, it is so easier, because there are certain things, there are certain sort of structures. I make it fall into those structures and I write. It's very easy, it's very comfortable. But truly, when I see something, when I find something, when I discover something, it becomes very, very difficult, because language is sort of it's got a structure of its own. And to make an image which I quote unquote, which is potent, to make it go through that process is truly a task, and that is where the challenge of an art critic or an art writer, if not an art critic, begins.
In the course of these most stimulating talks by our panel members, including, for example, stuff like conflict of interest, censorship, and objectivity. These kind of interlinked in some ways, because objectivity also means presumably the objectivity of the publisher. And since you mentioned it so vehemently and obviously with justification, I'm very interested in which this publication was to begin with, that consistently prevented you from saying anything critical about artists.